If you would, sir, please come forward, state your name, who you're here representing, please, for the record. Thank you.
I'm Matt Simpson from the ACLU of Texas. Appreciate the chance to chat with y'all. So I wanted to go back and talk about, you may be familiar with the litigation the ACLU was involved with in Tenaha in about 2010. It was settled in 2012. And I think it illustrates what we're talking about. It's another example. In Tenaha, it's a city in Texas near the Louisiana border, there was a routine practice of local law enforcement pulling people over and essentially shaking them down for money. They would, identify folks that were maybe from out of state by their license plate, sometimes by their race or ethnicity, and they would pull people over and, like I said, try to use asset forfeiture. Now, at that time, we had not passed SB 316, Senator Whitmire's bill, and so they were actually signing away their rights to these assets there literally on the side of the road. So thankfully, we've ended that process. But I would note that it wasn't uncommon in this context for money laundering to be the charge or the basis that was the nexus for asset forfeiture. It actually is incredibly disturbing to me to hear anecdotally that charge is being used still. In a way, it feels like that should have been shut down by the Tenaha case. The other thing that happened in Tenaha that I think is an illustration of why we have to be careful to regulate this is, in some cases, parents were threatened with their children being taken to foster care on the side of the road. So it's not even just a financial problem or a financial threat. Or a criminal threat. Then you start to get into you're going to lose your children. And in fact, one 16-year-old was taken from his father during the course of these poor seizures. ACLU sued. Tenaha agreed to a settlement that had some interesting components to it. It was a very restrictive settlement to ensure that these practices were not happening again. Law enforcement videotaped all stops. Officers must state on the videotape what the basis for the stop was. They had to advise the subject of their rights. Anything that was found to be improperly taken was returned within 30 days. And all proceeds went to either training or a nonprofit. So as you can see, our state law is not that limited. That's a much more narrow limitation on use. Around the same time, this case settled in 2012, as I said. In 2011, the legislature passed SB 316, which did provide us with some more reporting and more limitations on how the money from asset forfeiture could be used. It also got rid of roadside waivers. I guess I'm really partly here to say that was part of our effort to address these issues, but I don't think we got all the way there. I think there's still more work to be done. That legislation passed a few years ago now, and we're still seeing some of the same problems. So I think although we've started to work on this, we haven't finished our work. The last thing I wanted to talk about, actually there's probably two things. First, I'd like to say that I think these issues often make it appear that we're criticizing all law enforcement. And I want to be clear, not only is law enforcement concerned about bad apples or officers with bad practices, but I think that's actually where advocates come from as well. There is no reason that forfeiture can't be used for appropriate law enforcement purposes. We just want to make sure that the framework is such that it won't be abused. I think that there's a sense that, not only is the reporting fairly summary or cursory, but also not everyone reports. Not all jurisdictions report regularly to the AG. And so what's happening in those areas? I mean, we may know a little bit more about, say, Houston and San Antonio, but what about the small areas that simply aren't reporting? So I think that there's more work to be done on that front as well. The last thing I wanted to do, and I had meant to give you all this, I had exchanged some emails and phone calls with Brad Cates, who is a former Reagan appointee to the DOJ, and he was a director of various asset forfeiture programs. This past year, in 2015, he now lives in New Mexico. He was a big advocate for New Mexico's, basically their overhaul of civil asset forfeiture. And I just think it's compelling. I'll leave it for you all to review, but I thought it was compelling that someone that literally helped stand up these programs in the 80s had completely shifted and was now really thinking about the programs a little bit differently. One of his very interesting points, and I think it's been interesting to hear people talk about how the audits and the local budgeting works. One of his arguments is that this asset forfeiture money should actually be under the control of the state. This is general revenue, and it should be accounted for within the normal accounting practices. This was something that really came up in New Mexico. There was an interest in having this money not just be arbitrarily floating around or divided up 30 by 30 and then reporting going to the AG, but all the money from asset forfeiture in New Mexico now goes to the state, who then divvies it up and returns it to the departments. There were a few other aspects of the bill that are really good as well, but New Mexico, I think the thing I would say and highlight, although I'll let you read the details, New Mexico really decided that they had to go a little further. They took a much bigger bite at this issue than we've ever considered in Texas. Last session we had a number of fixes, and they were good proposals. But New Mexico decided to overhaul the whole system. And they did it partly in a response to one particularly egregious case, but also partly because there were a host of concerns. The last thing I'll say is that as much as we all want good accounting and we want to find a way to make sure that this money is accountable, we can't lose sight of the fact that we need good protocols for when someone's pulled over in the street as well. We need to set up the law so that it's clear to a law enforcement officer in the street, this is a scenario where it's okay to seize, this is not, and not have a situation where a defendant had their items wrongfully taken. So, developing law that's a little clearer and limits asset forfeiture so that we're not guessing at what is and isn't okay is important.
Thank you. Representative Canales, did you have a comment?
Just a question. When you're talking about New Mexico and the way that it goes into the coffers of the state, which sounds interesting, in that particular situation, are you aware, as of the conversation we were having earlier, if their attorney general or the counterpart there too is a party? I would imagine they are in forfeiture proceedings.
I'll have to get. I'm not sure. Let me look at that. Yeah, I don't know offhand. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.